Hello and welcome to episode 167 of Stand Up. Joining me today, my friend Jason Meaux from Louisiana, longtime listener and subscriber, wore a Fuck Trump t-shirt out in public and lived to tell about it. Then Yale constitutional law professor and author of a new book about president and immigration, Professor Christina Rodriguez will join me for the first time. And last but certainly not least, our favorite historian, Kenneth C. Davis, joins us to talk about the history of the post office, fascism, and political conventions. My name is Pete Dominick. Won't you please stand up with me right now? Yeah, we are off, and happy Monday to you. Thank you very much for joining me here on the show. Many of you listening around first thing in the morning. Love to hear people's morning routines, those of you that listen to the show almost every morning. So good to have you. Thank you very much for supporting the show. If you are a paid subscriber, I want to welcome several new subscribers. Kathleen Irani just became a $10 patron. Kathleen, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, Irani. Thank you for your subscription. Welcome to the community. Also, John Bogey signed up for a $5 subscription, as did Tarek Randolph, who is a longtime listener and I know a member of the Stand Up Facebook Garden Club, a guy I've been chatting with a lot. Tarek, welcome to Stand Up community, to you as well. Really happy to have you three joining over the weekend. Also, David Marino editing his pledge up from $5 to $10. Bill Holmes editing his pledge up from $10 to $20. Thank you all. Welcome to the community over the weekend. Speaking of generous, supportive people, Nick DiFabrizio and CJ Eichner came over to help me with the studio. And ladies and gentlemen, I am very excited to say this is the first time I am recording the podcast from the new studio. That's right, I'm sitting out in the Shedio right now. I am in the Shedio, and it is exciting, and I am very happy to have you joining me here. This is a big day for me, and I am so excited to be sitting out in my former garden shed right adjacent to my garden on one end, and the woods. I'm looking at the forest behind my house on the other end, and what a long way I have come, and we have come together, because it was early October of 2019 when I did my last broadcast at SiriusXM. I launched the podcast early November, and here we are with almost 700 paying subscribers. I could not be sitting in this shed without your subscriptions, without your support and your friendship. I am so excited to be here. I'll put up some pictures and some videos, and this is just a soft launch because I didn't know I was going to be able to make it out here tonight. But Nick came over today, and we put the molding on the windows and did a lot more work. And I decided to build the desk in here. I brought my computers, my equipment out here. It's still kind of rudimentary. I don't have a carpet on. The sound isn't totally the way I perfectly want it, but I'm ramping up for video and a live show and so much more. I could not do it without you. Thank you so much. It is so cool to be out here. My dog's out here with me, and my, with all the chaos and all of the concern and fear and panic that we all deal with at some point throughout our days, here is a happy guy talking to you right now, because this space that I'll be broadcasting from is really special. I'm right smack in the center of nature, and I can hear the cicadas at night, and it's dark and it's quiet, and I'm happy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Whew. All right, now that that's out of the way, I'll talk more about the studio and what I'm going to be able to do with it. I'll join you this Thursday night in a Zoom chat. I'm looking forward to that. Thursday at 8 East. Hopefully you can join me. If you're a new subscriber, we usually get over 60 people in there. We just hang out. I talk. I'm going to try to get a special guest to join me there as well that we can all ask questions to. So that's Thursday at 8. Mark it down in your calendar. And lots to talk about in terms of news over the weekend, of course. 166,000 Americans have died of coronavirus in our country. Over the weekend, late Sunday, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, announced she'd be recalling the House of Representatives for a Postal Service vote as Democrats are pressing the Postmaster General to testify. And so the House is going to cut short its summer recess to consider legislation that would counter changes at the post office that a lot of critics are saying undermine casting ballots by mail. And if you or someone you know is a postal carrier and wants to talk to me off the record or on the record, I'll protect your name. Reach out. I'd love to talk to you. I've already got one person that hopefully I'm going to be connecting with and taping with this week. Got a great week of shows, a lot of really exciting guests that are going to join me. And I want to get right to the show. I know you're worried about the post office. I know you're worried about coronavirus. You're probably worried about your job. You're worried about plenty of things. Stay in the moment. Stay with me. You're not alone. My first conversation today is with a guy who I've become really good friends with. His name is Jason. He lives in Louisiana, and he's a family man. And I've gotten to know him well over the years. When I was working for CNN back in 2010 and SiriusXM, I went down to New Orleans to report on the oil disaster there, the BP oil disaster in the Gulf. And Jason was kind enough to host me and take me out to dinner and show me around town. Such a great guy who I've learned a lot from. I love talking to, and he decided that he would wear his Fuck Trump t-shirt out in public over the weekend, and he lived to tell about it. Here's our conversation, getting in a little bit about Jason, his life, his politics, and why he would possibly do such a thing. And he's on Twitter at YoungSanta279. So look him up and follow him there. Jason Meaux lives in Louisiana. Where do you live exactly? Kind of, how would you describe where you live, pal? Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, you're welcome, man. I'm glad to be a part of your first studio broadcast.
Yes.
I'm down in Lafayette, so it's about 2 hours west of New Orleans and about an hour and a half east of the Louisiana-Texas border. So it's south central Louisiana. South of me is about 45 minutes to the Gulf of Mexico. So we're in a region called Acadiana, which is the epicenter of everything Cajun. So if you go anywhere in the country and you have Cajun spice or Cajun meats, the genesis of that Cajunality, if you will, is down here in Lafayette, Louisiana.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Vermilion Parish, which is even further south. So it's not technically the swamp, but I grew up in rice country. So I grew up on a rice farm where we formed rice and soybeans, and it was firmly in the southernmost part of Louisiana, basically.
Now, your parents are both Vietnamese?
No, but we have a huge Vietnamese contingent here in this area, and I think we're better for it. It's a great culture and hardworking people, and very, very awesome. They bring a lot to what I think is the melting pot of Louisiana, for sure.
So before we talk a little bit, I want to talk a little bit, if we have time, about how you formed your own kind of political thoughts and ideology, because you and I have known each other a long time. You've been listening to the show for a long time. We've been communicating for a long time. You showed me around New Orleans one time, but you walked into was it a Lowe's?
Yes.
A Lowe's store in your area, which is fair to say. How would you describe the politics in your area, how people vote, how people generally think? Like,
geez, it's majority red state, right? So it's been a red state for quite a few decades. And, oftentimes when I'm out and about, within the city, you'll see a big jacked up truck with 4-wheel drive tires and the big diesel exhaust pipes and a Trump flag and an American flag off the back of the truck. Yeah, get it. America. So it's extremely right wing, extremely Republican, very religious. But I think the differentiating factor here is it's not quite as bad as Alabama or maybe some parts of Mississippi.
Isn't that your state logo? Louisiana. We're not Alabama or Mississippi.
Yeah, right.
Don't get us confused. Well, you got that.
Point for Pete.
You get that French Cajun kind of influence in Louisiana, which would seem to separate. Sure. You got the New Orleans, you're on the Gulf, you get the oil, and going, and then the Cajun. I mean, I think I said everything there is about to know there about.
Yeah,
Louisiana.
but I think there's one differentiating factor here in our area, and that's the Cajun culture. So I guess our history in 30 seconds or less is all of our people were exiled from the Nova Scotia area up in Canada because they didn't want to conform to the religious expectations to the crown back in the 1700s. And so my ancestors basically made their way all the way down the East Coast and settled here in Louisiana because the Spanish basically gave them land for free. And it was land that was inhabited with, water moccasins and alligators and all these nefarious critters. And they made their home here. And despite the politics and despite some of the things that we don't care about or care to endear, this place is known for having one of the most endearing cultures in the entire United States. Many people come here for festivals of a wide assortment of types. And, the people here are very friendly despite the politics. And it's the cuisine, the Cajun cuisine obviously is huge.
You say friendly,
music's awesome.
You say friendly and endearing. What if you're a black person?
I think it still applies. I think whenever where it changes is in some of the communications we'd have when the conversation switches to politics. I think it definitely changes there.
Let me just cut to the chase because I think this is so fascinating and I want to get to what happened. So you decided you would wear a T-shirt that you're wearing right now. Yep. Fuck Trump. It says fuck Trump like 50 times down the front of it in different colors.
Yeah.
And
it's only 4 times and it's in like a 70s font and
right.
Each fuck Trump is in a different color.
And you said you thought you'd wear that out in public, specifically to the Lowe's hardware store where it's probably.
Yeah, I didn't intend to go to a Lowe's specifically, but I just intended to wear it out in public that particular day, which was day before yesterday. And day before yesterday.
Some people wouldn't wear a T-shirt like that or put a certain type of bumper sticker on their car because they don't want a hassle. They don't want to get in a fight, much less stabbed. You are a larger fella, and people are intimidated because you're a big guy. How big of a guy are you, would you say?
So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was a little over 6 feet and about 280 pounds, but being as though I hired your wife as a personal trainer, she has graciously helped me lose 40 pounds.
She also, I think, the thing that's unique about Val is she also helped you lose height. You're now 5'4", which she really specializes in shrinking people.
Yeah, it's the Hobbit factor.
You said your height. Yes. Okay. So you've lost weight. You're down to what?
I'm down to, as of yesterday, I'm down to 236.
Wow, that's great, dude. So you're a big dude. You're still a big dude, no matter what. Even at your target weight, you're a big dude. You're covered in ink. You have tattoos on your legs and on your arms, and you have your hair styled in a mohawk fashion because you shaved your head out of solidarity with your mother-in-law who's going through chemo. Do I have it right?
Correct.
So you are an intimidating-looking guy based on kind of stereotypical. I mean, it would be funny if you had some weird flamboyant voice with that body, tattoos, and hair. If you walked into Lowe's like, "Fuck Trump, everybody, screw him real hard. My name's Jason," and so, but you don't. You sound like you do. So anyway, what? Some people wouldn't do that. You're not suggesting that people should do that, and some people couldn't do that. No. But why did you do that, and how did it go?
So I can tell you a quick preface. Whenever I put it in the Amazon cart and I had it mailed to the house, the wife was like, face palm. I can't believe this is happening.
T-shirt?
You're not going to wear that in public? I said, yeah, so most definitely I am. So I got dressed. I put it on and we went to get in the truck. And she's like, "Are you really wearing that?" I said, "You damn right I am." So we hop off and we were going to do some landscaping work. So I had to pick up a trailer from a buddy of mine to get some aggregate and some gravel and mulch and all that stuff. And I needed a tarp to separate the items. So I stopped at Lowe's on the way to his place and hilarity and endearingness and all this great stuff ensued.
What type of interactions did you have? Take me through your visit to the Lowe's hardware store in Lafayette, Louisiana, deep red district, while you were wearing a "Fuck Trump" T-shirt.
Yeah, it was awesome. I had 3 interactions. The first one was within 30 to 45 seconds of entering the store. As I was, I took a right and I went down the paint aisle thinking that that's where I'd find the tarp that I need. And they had a gentleman pushing a cart who had a Trump 2020 face mask and a Trump 2020 muscle shirt. And he, even though I couldn't see the entirety of his face, he looked to be in his early 50s. And he looked at me and I could tell his face turned red and even his head turned red. And I don't know if it was out of shame, but I would speculate it's probably out of anger more so than shame. And I passed him and I kind of gave him a quick nod and I walked by him slow enough so he could read my shirt, which he obviously did. And I felt like that was a win. And I was like, it's mission accomplished. And so I got to the end of the aisle and they had a Lowe's employee there. And so I asked him, excuse me, sir, can you help me find a tarp? I'm looking for a big blue tarp. And the gentleman turned around and he's like, yes, sir, I can. And he saw my shirt and he immediately busted out with a belly laugh. He's like, oh my God, I love that shirt. He says, you should have seen it. I just helped these 2 people and they were in complete Trump regalia. And I was like, yeah, passing down the aisle here. And he's like, oh, this is so awesome. He says, I'm so glad you're wearing that. And he says, yes, I know where you need to go. So we went down. It was on the kind of the opposite side of the store where he was taking me. And the whole way we were walking, he was talking and he was like, he says, I'm so sick of this. And he said, straight in the middle of everybody, he was like, yeah, I'm a homosexual. And, my partner has been telling me that, we need to think about, where we're going to live because sometimes these people here are way too cruel. And I was like, I said, there are people here that love you for who you are. There's no need to move if you don't want to. And we just kind of had really pleasing conversation. We didn't find what I needed. So he called on the radio, found what I needed, and he sent me to a different section of the store. So
no, that's not what you told me yesterday. You told me you guys found the tarp and you wrapped yourselves in it and you made love to the young Lowe's clerk.
We did. And it was hard because, to keep those sounds of ecstasy, muffled.
That's what the tarp was for. You can't be having gay sex at a Lowe's in Lafayette, Louisiana.
yeah, we were looking for the mineral oil too. But
that's awesome. So this guy who admits he's gay and is so happy to see you probably goes above and beyond to help you out.
He does. And then he gives me precise directions where I need to go. So it was in the outdoor section. So I go through the sliding doors and I get outside and there was a gentleman assembling wheelbarrows. And so the previous employee told me that they would be kind of where this gentleman was assembling wheelbarrows. And so I was kind of looking around and I couldn't see. So I shuffled a little further past where his work area was looking for the tarp. And he read my shirt and I saw him stand up. And so I turned and I focused my attention toward him. And he said, is that how you really feel? And I was like, what about this? And I pointed to the shirt and he says, yeah. And I said, yeah, man, fuck Trump. And I said it loud enough to where a couple of people looked. Then he said, he paused and he took about a 2 or 3 second pause. And he said, man, I didn't think people like you existed in these parts. And I was like, well, of course we exist. And I said, so what this man's doing to our country is unforgivable, in my opinion. And I said, this is a country of people, regardless of race or creed. And I said, it's, there is somebody that cares about you, despite the president's bullshit. And he's like, man, that's all right. And I said, look, I even have this. And so, my wristbands, my Funk Trump.
This is a black
bracelets. Guy? Yeah, he was a black gentleman.
Because you sent me a picture of you and him. I think I just buried the lead. But
so he says, man, I like that, boy. He said, that's tight. I said, well, here you go. And you want one? He says, yeah, I want one.
You bought fuck Trump bracelets and you hand them out to people.
I do. I've actually mailed them out to a couple of your Twitter followers.
You have? If anybody wants a fuck Trump bracelet, go to Jason's Twitter, which is @YoungSanta.
Yep, Young Santa 479 or 279. You gave me the name.
at Young Santa 279. DM him your address, and he'll send you a fuck Trump bracelet.
Yeah, and so we had a really pleasant interaction, and I left him with like, "Hey, man, just making sure you understand what's going on with the Postal Service." I said, "You registered to vote?" He says, "Hey, bro, I ain't sleeping. I've been registered since I was 18.
Oh, good. That's a good move.
Exactly where to go.
Great,
and I was
great.
like, awesome. And so we did a fist bump, and off I went with my big ass tarp. And so I go into the line, I check out, and I could tell people are reading the shirt, and I could see you could see people, the crease in their eyes when they smile. And so I got a couple smiles, but no other interaction until I went outside into the parking lot. And so as I'm walking to the parking lot, I'm walking up to my truck, and I go to throw the big tarp into the bed. And the gentleman that I just had the interaction with and gave the bracelet to was sitting next to my truck in his vehicle having a cigarette break. And so we started talking a little more, and he was like, "Man, hey, hold on." And he says, "Man, this is a guy right here." And so he ends the phone call and he said, "Man, I was just telling my wife about you." He said, "Man, I can't believe this." He says, I'm still kind of, out of sorts with this. He said, "I don't know what to think." And I said, "Well, what you need to think is there are a lot of people here who don't, who aren't racist and aren't assholes." And we just talked a little more, and he was telling me a little bit about his background and where he works and how he works. And he and I I said, "You want to take a picture?" And he said, "Man," "even in my wedding, I didn't like taking pictures, but I'm going to take a picture with you." I said, "All right." So we took the picture, and that's the picture that I sent you. And it was an awesome experience, man. It was.
I'll share that picture in today's show notes on the Patreon page as well. Yeah. Oh, it's so great. It's so
great. Shout out to Stetson. His name was Stetson.
Shout out to Stetson. Also, you're going to be spending a lot of time at the post office mailing out those fuck Trump bracelets.
Yeah, and actually, my next door neighbor, one of my neighbors, is my wife's uncle. We live on family land, and he retired from the post office. He did a 4-year stint in the Army, and then he worked his entire career, over 40 years, for the post office. And he and I were standing under my beautiful Biden flag talking yesterday. He gave me a very pivotal piece of information that I was clueless about. He said on average, the U.S. Postal Service handles over 450 million pieces of mail a day. So to me, that was huge, because regardless of what the turnout is for November 3rd and the presidential election, even if you had 50% turnout, which we may or may not have, that's 170 million somewhat people. It's like it's not nearly the volume of letters and pieces of mail that the post office churns out on a daily basis. So anyway, that's
before we wrap up, I just want to ask you. I've known you for a while. I've gotten to know you really well in the last 6 months or so. That's for sure. And I wonder what makes you feel the way you feel about life and things and politics and values. Because your mom is can I say?
Yeah,
your mom is a big Trump supporter, but she doesn't have a Trump, sticker on her car, but she's going to vote for Trump because she's Republican. And I just think it's interesting, the difference in, generationally when parents raise kids to be like them and think like them to some extent politically, or to think opposite, which is probably pretty typical that you rebel against maybe your parents' ideology on any number of things. I rebelled against my dad because I wasn't into auto racing. I couldn't fake it. He took me to a race and my ears hurt. And I said, "Dad, my ears hurt. Can we go home?" And it just never took. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. So, and my dad was a staunch misogynist and racist himself. And I think what happened is I had 3 pivotal people in my life that educated me on politics and how to think for myself. And they were my best friend, kind of like my surrogate father, Steve, another best friend, Damien, and then his brother, Ricky, have all really coalesced in our group. We have a longstanding group that we've all been friends for multiple decades. And they took the time to tell me what was right and what was wrong in the realm of politics. And I learned a great deal from them. And, if I were to say something that was, uninformed or uneducated, they would give me the viewpoint that I needed. And so Steve, Damien, and Ricky. Those three gentlemen have done more for me than anyone in my family other than my grandfather, who I've named my son after, right? And, shout out to those three guys. They're just amazing people. I still talk to them weekly to this day, and I love them all three dearly, and I value their opinion more than almost anyone on this planet.
Well, fuck Trump. Thank you for talking to me. Thank you for your support and like every possible way that you can support a person. And thank you for your time tonight. And thank you for your friendship, man. I have so enjoyed getting to know you better over this pandemic. And since I lost my job and using Marco Polo, and you've been so kind and generous to me, to my family, and you've been even a good role model for all of us. My wife thinks you're the bee's knees. And I awesome tell her, your job is only to save his knees. Stop talking about how great he is. She set a high bar, and I appreciate you joining me, pal.
Yeah, same here, man. Thank you for all you do, and I can't wait to hear this on the show.
Fuck Trump.
Fuck Trump.
All right, that's my friend Jason Meaux down in Lafayette, Louisiana. Follow him on Twitter at YoungSanta279. Great guy, generous guy, thoughtful guy, passionate guy, and I love having him as part of our community, the stand-up community, and hopefully we've got you as well. If not, then join up right now. Sign up with a paid subscription. Go to the paid subscription link in the show notes. If you haven't given a review to the show, please do. And let's move along with today's class, where we will head to New Haven, Connecticut, and Yale. All right, I didn't go anywhere, but I did call up a Yale law professor who has co-written a new book about immigration and the president's powers. It's called The President and Immigration Law. She tweets at CM Rodriguez 95 at CM Rodriguez 95. We had a fascinating conversation. I was happy just to be able to hang with a Yale professor for a little while, and I hope you'll get her book. And I think this is a very important issue about immigration, and I'm very happy to be talking to a Yale professor of law. Here it is, my conversation with Christina Rodriguez. I learned a lot. So I've got her now, Professor Christina Rodriguez, who is the co-author of this important new book. And I'm very excited to be talking to a Yale professor. I don't think your university would ever allow me anywhere near with my grade. So this is an honor just a bit. How did you end up at Yale? Because you did your undergrad and law school there?
I did. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I went to college at Yale and I went to law school here, and I moved around a bit after that and started my career at NYU, where my co-author teaches now, and then was given a job offer here and came back to New Haven. I couldn't get away.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, which is part of the origins of my interest in immigration law. My whole family's still there. And pre-pandemic, we used to go all the time.
Yeah, I was kind of getting at that. You know, your last name is Rodriguez, and I was wondering what your relationship with that name and that ethnicity is, and kind of where you grew up and how that informed you. And before we get to the scholar, I would be interested in kind of your experience growing up, your family's experience growing up, and how that, if at all, painted your work or inspired you to do the work that you're doing.
My family's history has definitely shaped my interest, or at least it ignited my interest in immigration law and immigration politics. My father is actually from Cuba, and his parents were as well. And they came to the United States in the 60s. And one of the things that I've learned through my work as a scholar is that among the reasons they were able to do that was because President Lyndon Johnson made it a priority, for a lot of reasons, including foreign policy reasons and political reasons, to admit lots of Cubans in the 60s. And then on my mother's side, I'm Puerto Rican. And so she was born a citizen, but was also, in a sense, a colonial subject. And like a lot of Puerto Ricans who moved to the United States, have the experience of adapting to a new society, even though they have the citizenship status. And then those two things combined with growing up 3 or 4 hours from the border and living in a bicultural, bilingual world to make the questions related to immigration policy, how people get in, how they become Americans, how people receive them, how society changes when new populations arrive, to be of the utmost interest and importance to me. So it was almost overdetermined that I would end up studying immigration law.
Fascinating. I'm glad I asked about that, because I think it is really interesting when, having your own personal experience, and then especially, your dad's Cuban, your mom's Puerto Rican. Where did they meet?
They met in college in Washington, D.C. They both went to college there in the mid to late 60s, and they hung out with a bunch of different people from Latin America, and they met and ended up settling in Texas.
Is there any way to generally speak about how immigration law in the United States has changed over the past whatever time frame you decide to choose, Professor? Because I often hear this phrase, I often think, and I hear this kind of, come here legally like we did. And I often want to respond with that path is no longer there. They took it down. Come across the bridge like we did. We'd love to. They took the bridge down. Metaphors.
Yeah, immigration is a lot more regulated now than it was, say, 150, 200 years ago. It's not the case that we always had open borders. There were efforts to kick out undesirable, quote unquote, undesirable immigrants at the state level early in our American history. And then by the late 19th century, Congress was adopting laws to exclude immigrants. Most famously, they adopted the Chinese exclusion laws in the late 19th century, which were provoked by anti-Chinese sentiment beginning in California that featured in a lot of places around the country. But what is distinctive about our time is that since the 1950s, the rules governing immigration have become more and more intricate. And it's not that there aren't lots of paths into the United States. Millions of people enter in various ways. But for some people, there's no possibility of entry. It used to be that people could show up and then they would be screened, or they might be excluded because they had diseases or were fit into a category of undesirable types. But now things are really organized by stream. And for I would say the vast majority of unauthorized immigrants who are here today, there is no route into the United States through one of these legal channels. And yet there is demand for their labor, their interests that they have, like protection from persecution or harm and other things like that impel them to come. And so it's not so simple to say, just get in line.
Before we get to the specifics of your book, The President and Immigration Law, which is fascinating and super important and super relevant, just if you don't mind, a couple more just general questions here. My understanding is that the vast majority of people who come to this country and who are here now illegally because they came in legally, usually through a vehicle, a plane, a train, or an automobile, usually planes, I think, or cars, and then they overstay their visas. What percentage of people who are here illegally came in legally and overstayed their visas versus came in illegally or under the radar? Is there a way to measure that statistic?
There is a way to measure it. I don't know the precise statistic off the top of my head at the present moment, but I think at least a majority of people who are here without immigration status came on some kind of visa. Usually it's a temporary visa that then expires and the person stays on. Sometimes it can even be a tourist visa. But the population of unauthorized immigrants consists of a lot of people whose initial entry was lawful. And then, of course, it consists of millions of people who somehow entered unlawfully, without inspection is the term that's used in immigration law. They crossed the border in some fashion without seeing an immigration official.
The most fascinating thing about the immigration issue, is that it's one of the most divisive issues in our country. But my understanding is that it's also an issue that doesn't really have special interests influencing and spending a lot of money on it, meaning any other divisive issue, from guns to drugs to anything financial, legal, there's all types of special interests and super PACs and just generally industries. But when it comes to immigration, all of those big money influencers, from the agricultural community to the religious community, they're not spending money. They're not organized. This doesn't have the anti-immigration side, if you will, if I'm going to make it a binary, doesn't really have special interests, yet it's one of the most divisive issues in the country. Is that accurate?
It's an interesting way of framing it. I think that it's accurate to a point to say that there aren't interests spending the levels of money you might see when it comes to other central policy areas. But there are interest groups organized around immigration. A lot of them don't have a ton of money. They might be the ACLU or immigrants' rights organizations like United We Dream, the coalition of dreamers who've been pushing for various kinds of immigration reform. And they get funding from foundations and they might raise money in other ways, but they're not these enormous moneyed interests. There are some moneyed interests that intervene in immigration debate. So the biggest, best known example is probably the Chamber of Commerce, which on the employment side has interest in immigrant labor at various levels, various sectors.
But they're mostly, Chamber of Commerce is mostly pro-immigration, but it's also traditionally a conservative leaning organization, which wants to get rid of all regulations and pro-capitalism, blah, blah, blah. Yet they're also pro-immigration, which is a more kind of liberal idea in America.
Yeah, so I think on the anti-immigration side, at least today, your special interest is the Republican Party. It was not always that way. And there are still some Republicans out there who are not anti-immigration, in part because of business interests, religious interests. But it I think, derives much of its political power from the substance of the issue on the anti-immigrant side of the debate.
Okay, final kind of general question about immigration. I was preparing to interview you, and I was watching one of your talks on YouTube, and you mentioned something about the kind of morality of borders. And this is something I haven't read a lot about, but I've heard people talking about. I have no idea what to think about this, but how much scholarship and kind of, I guess, is it philosophy or sociology is there on this idea about borders? Because if you think deeply about it or philosophically about it, even if you're not an educated person like I'm not, it's kind of, you're lucky to be born where you're born, or you're unlucky to be born where you're born. You didn't earn it. You didn't do anything for it. It's just luck or serendipity, whatever you want to call it. Is there a lot of thought, scholarship in that idea, the morality of borders themselves?
Well, you just captured the core moral issue beautifully, which is that no one controls where they're born, but where you're born can determine your life chances, and it's arbitrary.
Right.
There is a lot of scholarly work on this subject. There's an area of political theory where people try to think through the morality of borders. And there are some people who believe that because they are arbitrary, that the only moral policy is one that approximates open borders. People who believe that also understand that you have to regulate movement across borders, and we live in a world of nation states. And so an open borders philosophy really translates into more open immigration and access to citizenship and things of that sort, and mobility. There are also, there are a bunch of libertarian scholars who believe the state shouldn't control people's choices, and among those are choices about where to move to and where to live. And so you definitely see among those types of thinkers a pro-immigration standpoint. And then there are those who think that any nation state has to be able to exercise sovereignty. You don't exist as a state or as a nation if you don't control who comes and who goes. And so border control is required and therefore necessarily moral.
Wow. You really were able to distill that down to a way that's such a great explanation for it. And I certainly want to learn more about all the different points of views on that. Okay. The book is called President and Immigration, and the President and Immigration Law. And your co-author is, as we said, professor at NYU. I think it's really interesting to be talking to you because you're also a constitutional law scholar, and the responsibility for immigration and immigration law is something that you can interpret in a scholarly academic way, which I think is super important to obviously be able to write this book. But I guess the main question that you're asking and that constitutional law scholars and Congress and politicians are grappling with is whose responsibility, who gets to make immigration law? Is it the Congress, the legislative branch, or is it the president and the executive branch? How did I do?
That's a great way of putting the question. So it's become a hot topic in constitutional law to think about who, is it Congress or the president, is in control of a particular policy domain. And you can ask this question of a lot of different areas of law. And we do that a bit in the book, but our focus is immigration law. And the last two administrations in particular have really made it seem like the president is driving immigration policy. And a lot of people attribute that to the fact that our politics is so polarized. Well, we can't get legislation through Congress, and the president has increasingly been acting unilaterally, whether he's a Democrat or a Republican, and those two things feed off of each other and produce these policies. But one of the goals of the book is to situate the president's control over immigration law in historical context and to show that this is not a new phenomenon, that for a variety of reasons, the president has long been a major player in shaping immigration policy and therefore shaping the nature of our society, the composition of our country. And understanding that is important to evaluating the various acts that our current president undertakes and understanding the structure of the law that enables him to do that and how we might change the structure of the law if we don't like what it produces.
Well, I mean, I feel, though, that the most important part of this is probably the issue surrounding the United States Senate filibuster, because what I've been covering this and talking about this issue long enough to know a little bit. And I was on the radio talking about this issue quite a bit in 2013. And so correct me if my recollection is wrong here, because I've said this a number of times. But in a very divided Congress, I think people can remember that far back. President Obama was president, his second term, and there were all kinds of politics in that campaign between him and Romney about immigration, of course. The United States Senate passed an immigration law with several Republicans voting for it. That law was what we call comprehensive in that it did all kinds of things to create pathways, as well as billions of dollars for border security that Republicans wanted. You had several Republicans, I always forget how many, voted for that. They passed it in the Senate. However, it's the House that it has to originate from, or that at least has to pass something similar. My understanding, my recollection is that John Boehner, the Speaker of the House at the time, would not hold up the Senate bill, would not bring the Senate bill up for a vote, because the concern was it would pass. If he had brought it up, it would have passed, and you would have had a massive, massive new law spending billions of dollars and creating all kinds of different pathways and helping the DACA folks, creating border security. How important is that moment in history when the United States Senate, as divided as we were, even with Mitch McConnell there, they passed a bill, but the House didn't vote? Did I get that right, that history?
You're making me feel wistful here. You did get it exactly right. And you've highlighted the contingency of so many things that have happened in immigration law and immigration reform, and just in the legislative process generally. What happened was the Senate, as you said, passed this major piece of legislation. Not everybody was happy with every piece of it, but it would have dramatically reformed the law and dealt with a lot of the sources of the problems that we have today. But then for a procedural reason, and probably also for the political reason that you describe, Boehner, who was the speaker, would not bring it to the floor. There was a rule, I'm not sure if it still exists, called the Hastert Rule, where a majority of the majority party in the House has to agree to take the bill to the floor. And so because a majority of Republicans at the time didn't want it to go to the floor, wouldn't have voted for the bill, it didn't go to the floor, even though it would have passed with the Democrats who were then in the House, plus the Republicans who were in favor of the bill. And so it's extraordinarily frustrating that something like that could thwart the passage of this major legislation.
A couple things on that. First of all, that's a horrifically anti-democratic idea, the majority of the majority. And naming anything after Denny Hastert is probably a bad idea, given what he is now, we know, guilty of some kind of child sex crime. I should probably know what it is before, but he's not a good guy. But the more important issue to me, he admitted sex abuse and went to prison, Denny Hastert. But the more important issue to me that again, knowing this history just a little bit, I think is so important. The government shutdown under Trump was over the wall, and funding for the wall. And what I kept saying, I think, and others obviously were as well, I'm never original with my ideas, was that the money that he wanted for the wall and border security was a fraction of what was in that Senate bill. They had that money. It was billions for the border security in 2013, and Trump wanted a fraction of it, and Democrats wouldn't give it to him then, and they shut down the government. And it's like, if only Republicans would have taken yes for an answer in 2013, we would not have been in that situation to have the government shut down. I think that history is important and accurate.
When you put it that way, it's kind of remarkable. I think that you're both highlighting the fact that Congress has routinely, especially since 9/11, but for much of the last 50 to 60 years, thrown money at immigration enforcement. And that's one of the central arguments of the book, is that enforcement has become central to our immigration regime. And that's part of why the president has as much control over it as he does. And yet there are people in both parties willing to say, when an enforcement initiative that is clearly purely political, like this wall, or almost entirely political, comes along, they're not going to take the bait, or they're not interested in wasting the money on something that is more a vanity project than it is something that will have a demonstrable effect on our border security.
Wait, let me dumb that down, Professor. You're basically saying if you care about border security, spending money in these other 10 areas will provide a lot more security than spending that money on a wall.
That's right. Okay. I think that at this stage, no one, very few people would think the wall, additional fencing, or other kinds of physical barriers will have a significant impact on whatever it is the wall is trying to achieve, whether it's stopping unauthorized migration, the patterns of which have changed substantially, it's subsided substantially over the last decade, or whether it's the kinds of benefits that the president claims for it, like keeping dangerous people out of the country, or reducing crime that's linked to immigrants. It has very little, if any, relationship to either of those goals.
I feel like it's important to go back to Obama, and you do in the book, in terms of, again, the 2013 bill that I'm mentioning here that failed, the comprehensive bill. It failed. It never got passed. And so as a result, President Obama did what he could, which was take a fraction of what was in that bill and use executive power to do what with DACA? Because it seemed that most of the constitutional scholars who I read and trusted said the President Obama can't do that and doesn't have the authority to do that. But he went ahead with it anyway. And I'm not sure what his Office of Legal Counsel, whoever, how they interpreted it. But how do you look back? What did Obama do? Because I'm floundering through trying to describe it. And what did you think of it then? What do you think of it now?
So in 2012, the president, the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time, John Napolitano, and others within the White House made the decision that it was time to control immigration enforcement directly. They had been trying, the Obama administration and people within DHS had been trying for several years before that to try to channel enforcement away from people who were generally sympathetic, like the children brought to the United States, the Dreamers, when they were children, and people who were just essentially workers, people living their lives, people who hadn't committed any crimes or weren't public safety threats. But they had difficulty doing that by just issuing priorities to immigration enforcement agents. And so by 2012, I think in part for political reasons. The election was around the corner, but also out of frustration that enforcement practices weren't changing enough. Senior leadership in the administration decided to do something direct. And what they did was essentially to create a program that laid out criteria that if people met, would make them eligible for having their removal deferred. And what was really significant about it was that the program created an application process that hundreds of thousands of people could then enter into and in pursuit of relief. And were they given the relief, or when they were given the relief, they were also permitted to apply for work authorization, which is really the thing that made DACA valuable, the ability not just to be free from deportation, but to work legally and therefore to live a life where you can plan and you have security. And so our view, and we state this very clearly in the book and in other things that we've written, is that was a permissible exercise of the president's authority both to choose how to exercise enforcement discretion by setting priorities, and also of his authority to supervise the immigration bureaucracy, to say, I want the Secretary of Homeland Security to determine what the criteria are for deferring removal, not line level enforcement agents who aren't politically accountable or who aren't making enforcement judgments based on the priorities that I as president or I as Secretary of Homeland Security think should be their priorities.
Oh, you are good at explaining things. So what's the difference between what the Obama administration did there and what the Trump administration did, as you write a lot about and talk a lot about, with the Muslim ban, which is, by the way, Professor, it is still a very weird two words to say together. It is so reprehensible. And I despise organized religion, all of it. But the idea that you would ban a religion, people who identify as such, from coming into the country, I don't use the phrase anti-American very often, but I mean, what a horrific concept. And as we talk about this, I just wanted to take a moment to say how haunting those two words are, even though I'm not a fan of any religion. So what's the difference there with the Muslim ban?
So there's a legal difference, which is the legal basis that the president invoked to enact the policy. And in the case of the Muslim ban, or the travel ban, as people like to call it as well, it was a statute, an explicit statute that Congress enacted in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War, that gives the president the power to deny the entry of any quote unquote alien or class of aliens if he thinks it's in the interests of public safety. That is a sweeping power. And in a sense, Trump was just using the power that Congress had given him in the code. There were two things that were different about the way that he used it. Most of his predecessors, with a few exceptions, have used that power in a very targeted way. There are specific national security threats, people who've been involved in human rights violations or other activities abroad that we think are dangerous, and we're going to exclude those people. There are very few instances of a ban like the one that this president enacted, which said all of the nationals of this country are not permitted to enter. And then the second thing that was different was that it is pretty clear to most people that, at least as far as the president himself was concerned, it was a way of making good on this campaign promise that we're going to shut Muslim immigration down, or shut down immigration from Muslim countries to one extent or another. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, the Supreme Court upheld it.
Yes. Yeah, the decision in which it did that was one of the more ominous decisions of the Roberts Court, of the court headed by Chief Justice John Roberts. I think that there were two components to it. The first, the court rejects the argument that the president's actually distorting his statutory authority, and finds that Congress did give him the power to do this. And we believe that that's correct. And we've written about that at length. precisely because the power is so broad. But what was shocking about the decision, surprised me and a lot of other people, was that the court said that even if the president has a discriminatory motive, if he also has a facially plausible reason, in this case, they weren't getting adequate information from the countries that these people were coming from, there wasn't adequate security information sharing, then that's enough. It doesn't matter if there's a discriminatory motive. And that is really inconsistent with anti-discrimination law generally and with the way religious discrimination is treated in constitutional law, and was not something I would have predicted. And is arguably farther than the court had to go. They could have tried to say there were clearly other motives at work here, and this evidence of discriminatory intent is not adequate, or the statements that he made were made before he became president. And the court does gesture towards those things, but it also says it doesn't matter if there's a discriminatory motive if there's another facially plausible reason. And that really is sobering.
Is there any historical precedent for that? I'm thinking of World War II with Germany and Japan. In terms of a ban with people coming in from a country that you are at war with? Because the argument, of course, from many on the right has been for a long time, since 9/11, for sure, that we are at war with Islam. Of course, George W. Bush famously said that we aren't. Right after 9/11, President Trump, of course, has always been saying that. And it's horrific because it doesn't even make any sense, really,
right,
to be at war with a religion of billions and billions of people, all of which probably interpret it differently. So is there a precedent with being at war with a nation state and banning their citizens from coming in?
Yeah, so that presents a different issue. If you are literally at war, formally at war with a nation state, banning the entry of their citizens is a different matter altogether. But that was not the state of affairs when Trump issued.
Okay, well, fine. Was anybody making that argument? I'm sorry. I mean, I think you might have just covered that in terms of this, the court's decision, the Supreme Court's decision, the majority opinion there. Nobody was making that argument.
No, okay. Nobody was making that argument because there was no formal state of war. It was a national security argument that the Department of Homeland Security and the administration as a whole had a reason to believe that the data that countries that were on the list was sharing with the United States about whether those nationals presented some kind of security threat or if they were who they said they were was inadequate. And that's in the second or third iteration of the ban. There is detail to that effect. The Secretary of Homeland Security had to engage in this worldwide review and determine which countries were providing adequate information about their nationals for immigration processes and which weren't. And so that was the national security justification. But I think most observers would say that was pretextual.
Don't get me. When I hear about this, I just want to talk about national security threats and the threat matrix and where they are. And I think now more than ever, we realize the terrorist threat is a domestic one. White supremacists, anti-government white nationalists. We talked about that on yesterday's podcast with a professor from American University, Cynthia Miller. It was really good. People should listen to it. But what about the current state of things? It's been pretty fascinating slash confusing and enraging to try to figure out who in the federal government has the authority or should have the authority or legally has the authority to police our nation's borders. It's very confusing. You see, the American military was activated, and there were a lot of questions about the legality of that. Obviously, we have this agency called ICE, and it seems like that's a fairly new agency created from the Department of Homeland Security post 9/11, and they even seem to be confused with what their responsibility is. So the question that you answer in the book is, or try to answer, is what are the judicial limits of who gets to have or who has the responsibility to defend the nation's borders?
Mm-hmm. So the president, in some general sense, has that responsibility, but Congress has created an enforcement machinery that's, as you suggested, already changed shape over time. The Border Patrol came into being in the 1920s, and it started out as a pretty ragtag operation, not hyper professionalized and not well resourced. Over time, that changed dramatically over the course of the 20th century. And I think, as I intimated before, since 9/11, the Border Patrol in particular has been flushed with resources. And so it's the Customs and Border Protection that includes the Border Patrol that polices the periphery, which is actually defined under regulations. This is something a lot of people don't realize, as extending 100 miles into our interior. And I believe that covers something like 2/3 of the United States. The entire state of Connecticut, where I live, is technically within the border. It's not that we see Customs and Border Patrol on our streets, although see Portland not too long ago, things have changed. But it's an authority that's pretty broad. And then there's ICE, which is the interior enforcement entity that's designed to do a range of things, including stopping trafficking and smuggling, but also initiating deportation and detaining people for the purposes of deportation. And that also has grown dramatically in size. And it is that enforcement bureaucracy that the president is in charge of that really empowers the president and senior leadership to have a major effect on immigration policy by deciding how to use that force and whether to wield that force in a way that creates terror or whether to do it in a way that targets groups that are deemed to be actual threats. And it's not to say that there is a benign way to use that force. Its existence in and of itself is threatening and in our view, overly large.
Well, only if you're an immigrant. It's not threatening to most, white citizens, who have been here for, like, most people look at, I think probably most people look at ICE and they're happy that they're there. And then if you talk to any person who has been subject to their authority, it's legitimate terror. It's terror. I don't know if it meets the legal definition of terrorism. I don't think it does, but it is. They are terrorizing people and using all kinds of different methods and practices. So,
yeah, and I think one of the things that the recent events in Portland and the way the president played those up has affected people is by awakening this realization that these law enforcement agencies exist that are primarily targeting outsiders or people who many Americans never come into contact with, but that they exist and have authorities that we didn't realize that could easily be turned on others. And, we have to have kind of different levels of concern. The people who are most directly affected by ICE and CBP are immigrants and immigrant communities, but they're interconnected to lots of people. I am connected to lots of non-citizens, and my community in New Haven contains lots of non-citizens. And the technologies that get used to police immigration also end up affecting citizens and permanent residents. The way that you have to prove your identity in the workplace or the surveillance technology that gets used can also be turned inward. And so the immigration enforcement apparatus is also part of that larger state of enforcement that is a source of concern for lots of reformers, not just in immigration, and they all have a relationship to each other.
All right, my final question for you, and this fascinating book deals with a unfortunate hypothetical, which, let's see, how do I frame it? If there is a free and fair election and a peaceful transition of power from the Republican Donald Trump to the Democrat Joe Biden, in that hypothetical where Joe Biden is the president moving forward from January 20th, what changes on these issues? What would he or could he, or has he said he would theoretically, again, it's a big hypothetical, and even if he's president, what can he get done with the Congress that we have and the intransigence that nothing gets done on the issue of immigration?
There's a lot President Biden could do. He could immediately rescind all of President Trump's entry bans, including those that were adopted for COVID-19 purposes that stopped lots of different streams of legal immigration. He could change the way the Trump administration has narrowed asylum policy by redefining asylum to cover victims of gang violence or domestic violence. He could change the policy at the border by allowing claimants to get an involved process to show that they might have legitimate claims to protection. He could also increase the numbers of refugees in the United States resettled. The Trump administration has forced that down to close to zero. I think in the last year, 13,000.
The most reprehensible thing in our country in a way is to not allow refugees into this country. It's just grotesque. Sorry.
Yeah. And that is something that the president does have statutory authority to control, and Biden could change that. But the one thing that, and he could also shore up DACA. He could try to expand it, though I would expect that to be subject to legal challenges if he were to try it. The one thing that he can't do is change the size of the deportation pool. He cannot unwind the deportation machine. He cannot give legal status to the 11 million people who are here without it. And so for there to be meaningful, long-lasting change that doesn't produce this back and forth, we need Congress.
What did Reagan do? Didn't Reagan give amnesty to millions?
He signed a bill. He signed the Immigration Reform Control Act of 1986. Okay. You should go back, and your listeners should Google this. There is a YouTube video of a presidential debate between George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan back in the day in 1980, where they're talking about immigration. This is a Republican primary debate, and they are both talking about the value of immigrants and the importance of providing a policy that is compassionate, and it is night and day.
Yeah, but that's not. I'll play that. I'll find that and try to play it on this episode after we're done talking here. But I mean, I interrupted you. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, it's not that Reagan was perfect. That bill in 1986 made the classic trade-off: amnesty or legalization for millions of unauthorized immigrants, and then a whole new enforcement regime that went after employers, which didn't exist in federal law before, and lots of money for border enforcement. So it's always this trade-off where you give some and then you build up your enforcement resources. But what's happened is that we haven't eliminated illegal immigration, and we still have the problem of lots of people here without status, and the deportation machine continues. Trade-offs
are dead, compromise is dead, and right-wing media dominates. I mean, right-wing media is the reason why you would never have that. Well, I shouldn't say never. I mean, remember who was it during the Republican debates of 2015 that said, was it Jeb Bush or somebody else that offered a scintilla of compassion for immigrants? He got booed out of the House. The Bush family itself was always kind of open to that, but right-wing media now decides how Republicans legislate, which is my opinion. But one more thing, I think that Joe Biden that you didn't mention is, and I wonder how much of an effect. We always look at the Supreme Court, but his ability, his power as president to appoint judges, wouldn't that have an outcome on immigration laws up and down?
I do think it could matter. I think that the Roberts Court has decided a number of immigration cases that cede too much power to the president and Congress to skirt what I think are constitutional limits. And so a different judiciary could undo that. But the courts are limited in how they can control immigration law. They can certainly have more or less protective approaches to immigrants' rights and more or less robust views of what due process requires. And it would be helpful to have democratically appointed judges who had a more robust view of due process, which applies to all people, not just to citizens. But the kind of change that Adam and I, my co-author and I, would like to see is change that has to come through Congress and it has to come through politics. The courts aren't going to solve the problem. They can just create backstops around the edges that keep things from being less awful.
You're a Rhodes Scholar, a professor at Yale. You've co-authored this very important new book, The President and Immigration Law. I'd like to wrap this interview by fishing for a compliment. I have an associate's degree. What grade would you give my questions for this interview on your new book and the issue?
I would say A+. I'm very impressed with your
Come on.
Washington politics.
Too high. It's too high. I'm sure that I could have done better. Thank you so much for joining me, Christine. This is a very important book and obviously one of the most important issues. And it seems like all of these important issues are buried under, the pandemic right now. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to talk about them and read books like yours and talk to people like you. Thank you so much for joining me and for writing this book. I look forward to doing it again, either just before the election or after the election or whenever you want.
I'm always happy to talk, and it was a lot of fun, and I appreciate you highlighting these issues, which I think will matter in the election and certainly after we get a new president.
Just real quick, the reason why I highlight these issues is the humanity of them. If you talk to people who are living in the shadows, and I've talked to so many of them over the years, you can't help but have this on your conscience and think about it. But it seems that most people are so disconnected from their own immigration story because they're third or fourth generation like me, or they're not. We're so self-segregating. But in media, I have access to and have been exposed to these stories for years, and you can't help but think about them on a regular basis, and what it must be like, as you mentioned earlier, to not know what tomorrow brings. Now, everybody's experiencing that, by the way, in terms of the uncertainty with the epidemic. But DACA, recipients or undocumented immigrants deal with that hour to hour. That's why I care about it, because I think about what that must be like and how it's just, as I mentioned, you're lucky. So in closing, what would you say about the humanity of those people who literally are the essential workers right now, more than ever, but yet living in the shadows, not knowing what tomorrow will bring?
There is this incredible paradox that the pandemic has surfaced of having essential workers who have no legal status. And how can that be? Right. And we hope that forces people to rethink the way they understand immigration law and immigration enforcement, and this idea of the rule of law, meaning requiring that people comply with the law. That's too simple a formulation. And if you understand the human toll that our deportation machine has taken, then the need for reform, not just electing a president who can do things like defer removal, but changing the underlying structure of the law so that people have security, can live their lives without the fear of law enforcement, without the fear of removal, and work without the fear of reprisal. It is an urgent task. And it's all about understanding the human dimension. I think that the way that the Trump administration has separated children from their parents at the borders has hit a lot of people in the gut and made them realize that we're talking about people's lives being destroyed through this enforcement system. And no goal could justify that kind of treatment.
Professor Christina Rodriguez, the new book co-authored with Adam Cox, is The President and Immigration Law. Go get it. Go learn more. And I'll talk to you again, I hope, soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pete. It was such a pleasure.
It was such a pleasure to talk to me about immigration law. Ooh, that was a tough one to prepare for and hang on. And I just think it's always super important. There's so many people that are living in the shadows today that are working their asses off, that are just like the rest of us, but maybe just weren't born here, but were brought here as children, like the DACA Americans, the dreamers, if you will, and they need our support, and we can't forget about them, even though we have such serious, seemingly, issues right smack in front of us. All right, finally joining me today. Oh, by the way, if you're over the weekend, we had friends over, and my friend's 13-year-old kid was in the pool with my daughter, and he kept spitting on her pool water. And I yelled at him not to do that, and then I got yelled at for yelling at him. So, isn't that? My wife told me that there's chlorine in the water, and it's just not an issue. I'm like, no one should be spitting on anybody anymore ever again. No, I'm not. No, but I got in trouble. What do you think? Who was right? Who was wrong? What would you have done in that situation? You hate to yell at somebody else's kid, but I thought that was I thought that was egregious in the COVID era. But I don't know. Maybe I was out of line. We're all learning together. All right, here's my conversation now with our favorite historian. Don'tKnowMuch.com is the website. Kenneth C. Davis is on Twitter. Of course, we talked this week about fascism, the history of the post office, and the history of the political conventions. He's always great. I called him up on the phone and we had a great chat where, as always, I learned a ton. Here he is right now. My favorite historian joins us now. Always so excited to be in his classroom, and you can be in his classroom too by hiring him to do virtual education for your organization, school, library, whatever. Just go to don'tknowmuch.com. But I've got him now one-on-one. Kenneth C. Davis, professor, welcome back. Thank you so much for letting us join you in your classroom again.
Oh, Pete, it's always a great pleasure to be with you, and it's certainly not a classroom. I always think of this as a conversation, not a lecture.
Don't tell me. And when it's you, it's a classroom. I don't have much to say. I don't know. I'm so ignorant. And even when you teach me something, I sometimes forget it and get excited like a fish with no memory to relearn it. So it's always good. And tonight I wanted to talk with you about the conventions. You have a great article at Smithsonian Magazine, which everybody should read, smithsonianmag.com. I'll link to in the show notes. I also wanted to talk to you about vice presidential picks. If we got to it, maybe a little fascism in history. But I wanted to start, because you said I could, by talking about the United States Post Office, because that's what's on everybody's mind right now with everything that's happening with the president seemingly wanting to slow things down, as we might have to go to mail-in ballots. And I was reading a couple weeks ago about the history of the post office, and I learned, Professor, that the United States Post Office has like the highest approval rating of any government agency, and it's completely funded not by taxpayer but by postage stamps. I think those are the only two things I know. What do we need to know about the history of this important agency and why it's so vital and important to our country's democracy?
Well, first of all, it is one of the oldest institutions in the American Republic. And let's remember that the very first Postmaster General was a guy named Benjamin Franklin. So that alone should put it up on a pedestal.
Any relation to the Benjamin Franklin?
Yes, the Benjamin Franklin.
It was Benjamin Franklin. Really?
The Benjamin Franklin was the first Postmaster General, and he was a man who, really believed in the importance of the mails and the importance of getting information to people, and that this was a significant part of what a republic had to do to last. And he was, of course, the one who said famously when they asked him about the Constitution, do we have a monarchy or a republic? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. And right now, that's, a little bit up in the air. And part of it is this assault on the Postal Service. Now, let me say that this didn't happen 3 years ago. This is like many things in recent American history. There has been a long-standing assault on aspects of the federal government by the Republican Party, which wants to privatize certain things. And one of the things that was done quite a few years ago now was that they passed a bill. I believe George W. Bush signed it into law, so it's within the past few decades, that the post office has to fund its retirement accounts for 75 years. Of course, no business or other institution in America has such a requirement.
Why would they hamstring the United States Post Office financially? This is politics, not history, I know. But the question becomes, what is it that Republicans, what is their motive for that financial scheme, which makes it very hard for the United States Post Office to stay solvent and in operation? My understanding is the reason is because, like many other government ideas, they want it to be privatized. They don't want government agencies, government services. They want it to be FedEx, DHL, Amazon, and UPS, other delivery. They don't want the United States Post Office.
That's right. The first step in this, and I wasn't really prepared to do the whole history of the Postal Service, but let me just say that one of the turning points was during the Reagan administration that the Post Office was required to fund itself, which is the only thing in the government that has to fund itself. Everything else that the government provides is funded through taxpayer money and through the sale of bonds and the use of debt. And that's how we have roads and armies and all of the other things that the federal government provides to us. Nobody else has to earn their keep that way. So this was absolutely part of the Republican core value of getting the government out of things that private industry has done. And there was always the belief that private industry could do things more efficiently and more profitably and better. And but that has not proven to be the case in many situations. And over the years, of course, there have been all sorts of conversations about transforming the Postal Service and changing postal regulations. Let me just tell you that I know from being, I'm in New York and we get our mail delivered, but when you're out in somewhere else outside the city, the post office is so central to people's lives. It is really the thing that connects most people to the federal government, more so than any other, apart from those people who get Social Security checks, obviously. The post office provides a very, very unique contact, one-to-one contact between the American people and the American government. Right. And as you say, most people are really happy with the service they get. It's quite incredible to me still, and I don't know what a forever stamp costs at the moment. I just buy forever stamps and I use them. But that it's pretty remarkable to me that you can just put a stamp on an envelope and it gets pretty much everywhere. And they've done a great job in terms of overnight and priority mail. So I as a person who uses the post office a great deal, think it's a great American institution. And the assault on it that we are seeing right now is really a fearsome assault, not only on a federal institution that the people like, but it is completely connected now to this assault on the integrity of our elections. And that's really a frightening thing. I believe that this is a national emergency. I don't know why Congress, I've tried to call all three of my Congress people today. And of course, calling your congressperson isn't that easy. And that's another question for another day. Yeah. But we really have to say that this is a matter of urgency. I'm seeing these pictures of people going around in Manhattan picking up mailboxes and taking them away. We see this report today about these machines being carted off that sort millions of pieces of mail. This is what Steve Bannon said a few years ago, the destruction of the administrative state. We're seeing this, and I am not calling this administration fascist, but this is typical of what the strongman does in history. And as you know, I have a book called Strongman coming out in a few weeks. It talks about what these authoritarian leaders do, and taking over certain aspects of the delivery of information to people is key to what a strongman, authoritarian leaders do. And if it affects and changes the election outcome, it's all the more to their power. So I really do think this is a fraught and dangerous moment for our republic.
And folks, Ken Davis has been joining me for years. I don't pay him or any of my guests to join me. You should pre-order his book right now, and I will, again, link to it to make it easy in the show notes. Strongman, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy. Is it because you really detest getting political in your work? When do you call when do you call this government, our government now, fascist? Like, what are they missing qualifications, or you just feel uncomfortable weighing in at this point?
Well, a true fascist state, first of all, would be a one-party state. And so at the moment, we still have a two-party state. It would mean that the one party controls all aspects of the government, including the courts and the legislature. We're not there yet. So that's why I'm not. I think it's very dangerous to throw that word around too casually. So I'm very careful about using it myself. I should mention also, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, I think, but today is the day that Harry Truman said, "This is the day when fascist and police governments cease to exist in the world." And the fascist police are going by my apartment right now. No, I'm kidding. That's probably an ambulance. That was a joke, guys.
They're coming. They're not here yet.
They heard me. They obviously heard the conversation.
Oh, my God. It would be so funny and horrible for you, but funny for the rest of us if we just heard you now being taken away.
Yeah, the rubber truncheons got. So no, this is the day 75 years ago, August 14th. That's the day we're talking. I don't know when people will hear this, but this is the day that Harry Truman said, "This is the day when fascist and police governments cease to exist in the world. This is the day for democracy." We are marking the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II today, and I'm really amazed that it's not getting more attention than it is. This day, if you go and look at my website, don'tknowmuch.com, you'll see a picture of 2 million people in Times Square, not social distancing. They are partying because World War II was over.
Right.
The Japanese had surrendered and the war was over. Of course, that meant the dropping of 2 atomic bombs and everything that meant. It was an extraordinary period in our history, but Harry Truman did really believe that this day when he said that 75 years ago. There had been a long, hard slog from December 7th, 1941 from the United States, from Pearl Harbor, to August of 1945. The defeat of Japan, to make that happen. And Truman thought it was, the end of something and the beginning of something new. Of course, it was, in a way, the beginning of the Cold War and another struggle that was very different. But that's why I don't think that this is ancient history, even though that happened 75 years ago. Everything that happened that day reflects on what's going on in the world and in our country today. We see the rise of authoritarian fascist rule around the country, totalitarian rule, authoritarians like Putin, like Duterte in the Philippines, like some of the guys in South America. This is a dangerous time for us if we really believe in these ideals that we said, back in 1776, a government for the people, by the people, of the people. Hello? Did I lose you?
My mic.
Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
My mic was off because I sneezed, and I never turned it back on.
I got worried there.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
What I was talking.
How long ago did you turn it on?
No. Well, I started talking. I switched gears when you got done. I said, "Well said," and then I switched gears, which was to this. Let's talk about the conventions, which is what we originally were planning to discuss, of course, that we are on the cusp, the eve of the virtual conventions because of the pandemic that rages across our country. You have a piece at Smithsonian Mag, which I'll link to in the show notes, titled "The Top 10 Political Conventions That Mattered the Most." And it's really as fascinating as anything else that you write and work on because it's history and you bring us so many events, so many stories that we've either forgotten or most likely never learned at all. First of all, though, before we go into the history of it, we were talking before we started recording. You basically said you thought the conventions as we knew them were already on their way out before COVID and virtual conventions. Why?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it really began, the real change began around 1972 when George McGovern and the very left wing of the Democratic Party at that time kind of rebelled against the party regulars and took over. And the role of the primary was increasing because all these states saw, hey, New Hampshire, millions of people pay attention to what's happening in New Hampshire, and journalists go up there and spend a lot of money. We should have a primary. So that's part of it. But the states began to want to influence the decision by having primaries. And so from 1972 on, you had enormous growth in the primary system, so that by fairly recently, the idea that the convention was going to decide the nominee was already a thing of the past. Most nominees in recent history were determined through primary elections well before the convention. There have been a few that were kind of close or went up to the end, but even Obama and Clinton, Hillary Clinton, back in 2008 was determined before the convention, as was the Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton situation in 2016. So this really changed from the 1970s on, and it really meant that the convention, which was once a moment of extraordinary high drama and often backroom deals, notoriously known as smoke-filled rooms, that gave way where the power brokers were really giving way to the role of the primary election in determining the nominee. There's, of course, nothing in our Constitution that talks about nominating conventions. There's nothing in our Constitution that talks about political parties. In fact, George Washington warned against them. He thought they were a bad idea. In the early history of America, most presidential nominations were really determined by members of Congress in what they called caucus, and we still use that word. Back then, it was the members from each party, and the party's names have changed over 2 centuries, would meet in caucus, and they would determine who the candidate would be. As more people wanted to have a voice in democracy, and democracy was opening up in the early 19th century, the nominating convention came into existence around 1831. It's interesting that the very first, and this is the first nominating convention I call out in my piece, is the 1831 Anti-Masonic Convention. Who were the anti-Masons? Well, 19th century conspiracy theorists. These were people who, yes, there were plenty of conspiracy theories in the 19th century. There were probably more then than there are now, which is
have you explored? I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I would love an article or even a book from you, the history of American conspiracy theories.
I think that it's been done, and I don't know, but I'll look into it. But this was a group that feared the growing political and financial power of the Freemasons, this secret society. Many presidents have been, including George Washington, have been members of the Freemasons. These were people who got together, the anti-Masons. They thought that these guys were anti-religious. They thought they were dangerous. They thought they were controlling all the financial and political power in the country, and they wanted to break the power of the Masons, the Freemasons. They disappeared like many conspiracy theory third parties of that time, including the Know Nothings, which was not so much a conspiracy theory, but just a very viciously anti-immigrant party in early American history. So the anti-Masons, though, get together in Baltimore, and they decide on a candidate for president. One of the Masons, anti-Masons, by the way, is Millard Fillmore, who later becomes president of the United States. But it was at that time that the other parties looked at this and said, well, maybe we should be doing that too. So in 1831, the Democratic, what became the Democratic Party, the names have changed a lot, nominated Henry Clay to be the nominee in 1832, and Andrew Jackson was also nominated in 1832 at one of these conventions. So King Caucus, as they said, was dead, and the conventions grew more and more after that. The next one I point to is really important because it was the first national, it's in 1856, the first national convention of the Republican Party. This was really the beginning of the two-party system as we know it today. The Republicans met in Philadelphia. They chose a man named John C. Fremont, a rather now obscure character who was really a fascinating guy. And he was the first Republican candidate for president. His party's slogan was free soil,
free speech, free men, Fremont.
It has a real ring to it, doesn't it? And then, of course, 1860, you have 4 different conventions because the Democrats split between the North and the South. And then you have the Republicans who choose Abraham Lincoln. And then another third party, which in this case was a fourth party that got together and chose John C. Breckinridge because they wanted to they weren't Democrats, but they wanted to protect slavery. And everything, of course, in 1860 was about the future of slavery in America. And, of course, Lincoln's election brings the secession and the Civil War over the issue of slavery.
So those conventions are in the summer of 1860, and then the Civil War begins in April of 1861. Is that right?
That's correct. Just a few weeks after Lincoln is inaugurated in March, because the president used to be inaugurated in March, which created problems, particularly that year, because there was a really long spell between the election of the president, which still happened in November, and then going all the way to March meant that the lame duck president, in that case, Buchanan, was in office, but really had very little power to do anything. So they changed the inauguration date to January during the time of FDR.
So we just mentioned, you mentioned 1856, you mentioned 1860. Everybody should read this article at Smithsonian Mag, but where do you want to go to next? Because I suppose we can't do the whole thing, and I don't want to fast forward to 68. But I'm
going to two that really, one that really stands out for me, and because it again gets into the third party thing, and it's one of the most fascinating elections in history. 1912, Republican Convention. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, had been the president. He became vice president in 1900. And shortly after the election of William McKinley, with Theodore Roosevelt, the youngest vice president to that point, McKinley was assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes the youngest president in American history. He finishes McKinley's term, wins a second term of his own, enormously popular, really a larger-than-life character in many ways. But he thinks that the precedent was set by George Washington. He's not going to tamper with it. He won't run for a third term. His place is taken by William Howard Taft, which people joke said meant take advice from Theodore, meaning Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt wasn't too happy being on the sidelines, and he didn't think Taft was doing a very good job. So he decides to run for president again in 1912, splits the Republican Party. Taft runs as a Republican. Roosevelt runs as a bull moose progressive candidate, and Woodrow Wilson, because these two split the Republican vote, Woodrow Wilson wins election in 1912, the Democrat. So it was a fascinating convention, but also a fascinating election. I think that I could talk about this for a long time, but the one that matters
I could listen for a long time.
I think the one that matters most to me personally, because I was really coming of age when this happened, is 1968, obviously, right, which was the last of the, really extraordinary big-time conventions where movers and shakers in the party were making things happen. But it was also set against the anti-war protests of 1968, the fact that Lyndon Johnson had announced in February that he wasn't going to run for another term. That opened up the way for Robert F. Kennedy to run as a young senator, the brother of John F. Kennedy.
Son of Joseph, brother of John. That's correct. Sorry.
Of course, it was that in that same year, right after Johnson makes his decision, Martin Luther King is assassinated in March of 1968. A few weeks later, Robert Kennedy on June 6, 1968 is assassinated. So that was the picture of the country, which was also really coming apart over Vietnam. When the Democrats opened this convention and Hubert Humphrey, who had been Johnson's vice president, is expected to be the candidate. But there were thousands of people in the street outside protesting against the war, and it turned into a pretty bad riot. I mean, when I look back, I was watching that, being a teenager, kind of getting interested in politics. The whole world was coming down around.
Did you say where that was?
They later decided it was in Chicago. Famously. It was later determined to be a police riot. One Democratic senator actually told the convention that there were Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. Speaking of
what do
fascism.
you mean? What do you mean police riot? The police were rioting?
The police had actually created and caused the riot and caused the violence that broke out.
What?
Just as we have seen police in 2020, police and federal officials of a different kind, different stripes, attacking protesters. That was pretty much the situation in 1968 in Chicago, and it was really a complete and utter shock to the American political system. And that's why I say I really came of age as a kid watching that convention on television. And this was the day when the conventions were really major television events. The networks would talk about the fact that they were going to have gavel-to-gavel coverage. That was a big deal. Right, gavel-to-gavel coverage. We're going to show the whole thing. And that meant all the speeches, and that meant all the nominating speeches, and then each state having the roll call. It was very dramatic because in some cases you didn't know was somebody going to get the ballot on get the nomination on the first roll call. So it was a moment of high drama. By the way, in 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt, you would think, well, he would have walked in, but it took 4 ballots for FDR to get the nomination in 1932. And, of course, that signaled a whole new era in American politics. And he went on, of course, to become a president who was elected 4 times. So this is an extraordinary piece of our history that the primary system has now pretty much diminished its significance. I mean, we still watch because of the speeches, although, pop quiz, who gave the keynote in 2016 for the Democrats?
You said the primary diminished its significance. Do you mean the convention or the primary process?
The primaries because they now routinely determine who the candidate will be well before the convention starts.
Oh, I see. Where it used to be at the conventions is when the candidate was determined.
That's right. And sometimes it took many, many ballots. Like I said, in 1932, it took 4 ballots to get FDR on the ticket. So it used to be high drama, and there was a lot of wheeling and dealing going on. This was, as I said, the era of the so-called smoke-filled rooms, where guys with cigars were deciding who the next president was going to be, and they made deals about who the vice president pick was going to be and how many slots in the cabinet they were going to get. And those sorts of deals were being cut in the back rooms at conventions to determine and as this great democracy move continued, especially after 1968, by 1972, the Democrats had really turned the party almost completely over to nomination by the primaries, and so that was really the last time that the convention had that sort of drama. Of course, they nominated George McGovern, who then went on to be defeated in a landslide by Richard Nixon in 1972. in 1976, just to finish it out, because it was kind of interesting, even though primaries had mostly finished this out, Ronald Reagan challenged Gerald Ford, the incumbent president. Now, of course, he had been the unelected president.
Right, because Nixon resigned.
Because Nixon appointed him vice president, first of all, because Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned. Ford was appointed, so he was the first president who was not elected president or vice president in history, and that factored into some of his weakness. But Ronald Reagan challenged him in 1976 and pushed pretty hard, but the Republican Party stayed with the incumbent president and renominated Ford, who lost to Carter that year. 4 years later, of course, Ronald Reagan comes back and sweeps his way to the nomination. So this whole process has really changed so much, certainly over 200 years, but certainly even more so in the last 50 or so years, so that we don't have the nomination determined at the convention anymore as we once did. It's mostly a question of are they going to fire up the base, or what's the platform going to look like? Can somebody actually deliver a speech that's meaningful? And as I said, who delivered the keynote speech in 2016? I know who did it in 2004 because it was Barack Obama, and that put him on the map. But that's a rare exception to somebody who elevates the convention to a high moment. Mario Cuomo did it as well in 1984, gave an amazing speech called the Tale of Two Cities speech that I still remember very well.
That makes me want to watch it right now. Mario Cuomo.
Oh, I think you should.
I think I'm going to do that tonight.
You should. Mario Cuomo's 1984 keynote address is a classic of American political oratory.
1984?
1984.
I'm looking it up right now. The keynote speech at the 2016 RNC, did you say? I think that was given by Antonio Sabato Jr.
No, I was talking about the Democrats. I was going to say, can you remember who did it for the Democrats?
In the Democrats 2016, it must have been, was it Obama?
No, it's not Obama. He was the nominee.
All right, now I'm cheating.
The nominee doesn't do the keynote.
Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren gave the keynote speech in 2016 at the DNC. Yes?
That's correct.
Okay. And for the Republicans, it was Scott Baio. I'm just saying now. No.
Well, and then
he did speak there.
You do have the conventions can still produce the strange, curious moment, and perhaps the most famous in recent years, and I don't remember what year it was exactly, Clint Eastwood.
That's right. I was there. I was in the room for that.
Yeah, that was a pretty much of
that was one of those things where being
Harold Pinter could have written,
where being in the room was very weird because you had no idea how that was interpreted on TV at home. Being in the arena and seeing that chair, you're like, did that go out over the air? Did everybody see that there was just an empty chair and that Clint Eastwood, I remember being in nosebleed seats with a whole bunch of journalists and asking, what the hell is happening?
So the bottom line here is I really think that because of the primary system really negating the importance of the convention, and then now this new reality that, why are we sending all these people and spending all this money to do something that we don't really need to do? This, I really do think maybe this is the last hurrah of a dinosaur of American politics.
Well, there's such a production now. It's such a production. I mean, not this year. I noticed I saw Joe Biden and Kamala Harris when they made their announcement, or the day after they did this presser, and it was just all kinds of lights and hoopla and production, and it's all a show now, even virtually, it's like there's nobody even there. Kamala Harris made her speech the other day, and it was so
deflating compared to past conventions. I mean, that wasn't a convention speech, but just because no audience there, it's going to be very strange.
Yeah, no, it is. You know, obviously, if you're giving a speech and you're playing off 10 or 15,000 people, it's an extraordinary moment. I should also mention the other highlight moment of recent conventions when Barack Obama did accept the nomination the first time around, which was in Denver, I believe. They moved it outdoors to a stadium, and 84,000 people were there.
Yep, that was an amazing night.
That was also, you know, an extraordinary moment in recent political history, unlikely to happen again anytime soon, although it could. But I tend to think that, you know, where are we going to be when 84,000 people are allowed to get together again?
That's a great point. Well, I've gone 5 minutes over my allotted time with you. You probably have others to teach. So listen, as always, we covered a lot of ground, the post office, little fascism, and, of course, the history of the conventions. Go to the show notes to get all the links to all of Ken's stuff. Buy all of his new books, including his newest book, which is all about dictators, and it's available now for pre-order. Don'tKnowMuch.com.
You can pre-order it now.
And, of course, More Deadly Than War, which we've talked about. Unfortunately, that book is extremely relevant. But get Strongman, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Rise and the Fall of Democracy. You know, I'm building my new studio as we speak, and I'm going to make sure all of your books are in every shot I do.
Okay.
That's quite
thank you.
That's quite a commitment. I don't know if I have enough space.
Yeah, well, you know, then we'll have to find out what the Rate My Room guy says about that.
Well, as long as I have a pineapple in the background, I think he'll appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me. I love listening to your professorship, your scholarship, I think is the actual word I should be using. Thank you, sir.
Well, it's fun for me to talk to you, Pete. We've been doing this for a long time, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I appreciate the opportunity. And, you know, it's always important to me to remind people that history is not dull, dry stuff. And this politics stuff is fascinating, but it's mostly about what it has to do with our lives. And that's why it's so important that we do stay involved, we do stay engaged, and we understand that a lot of people are like those who died 75 years ago fighting fascism, sacrificed a lot so that we have this right to vote, and we better not take it for granted.
Very well said. I have to go chain myself to a mailbox. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care, Pete. Thanks.
There he goes, Kenneth C. Davis, another great lesson. Great to be in the classroom of all of our guests today. Thank you very much for joining me. Go follow Ken on Twitter. Tell him that you heard him on the show and that he appreciated it, as always, at Kenneth C. Davis. His website is don'tknowmuch.com, don'tknowmuch.com. Go get all his books. And, of course, go buy Christina Rodriguez's new book and follow Jason Meaux on Twitter at YoungSanta279. Those are my asks. And, of course, if you haven't signed up for a paid subscription, now would be the time. I have to buy a new expensive, like $2,500 MacBook Pro to be able to do all the things I want to be able to do. So I appreciate your subscriptions. They're all going to a good cause. This is independent media, and I am responsible to you. So let me know what you like, what you don't like, who you want me to interview and have on the show. If you'd like to be on the show yourself, you got something to offer, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out. standupwithpete@gmail.com. And no matter what, you're not alone. I'm right there with you. There's ups, there's downs, there's good days and bad. But I'm really excited to be in this new situation. The podcast is taking off, and I'm so happy to have you supporting it. Thank you all. Tell your friends, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. I love you.